As a philosopher who does work in feminist phenomenology, a certain way of understanding and describing the contents and structuring of our gendered existence, my work considers how white women's subjectivity unconsciously draws on and reconstitutes allegedly old practices of gender and race because of the way racialized myths about rape are weaponized both overtly and subtly in the present. Feminist scholars, particularly women of color feminists, have long considered how the category of woman is normatively constructed and marked as white through very real and violent practices of rape against Black and brown individuals, and through myths of rape used to mobilize anti-Black sentiments, to promote and justify lynching, and to embolden white individuals to support and enlist in the KKK. For instance, in her very important book, Women, Race, and Class, Black feminist philosopher and scholar activist Angela Davis describes the way white gendered ideologies that hypersexualize Black men and frame them as sexual predators of white women sanction and falsely justify systematic, mundane, and fatal violence against Black men. We can see historical manifestations of this myth of the Black male rapist in the Black brute caricature popularized in the white American imaginary in the late 19th century, as racist propaganda in the 1915 silent film adaptation, The Birth of a Nation, as an underlying spark to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, and more recently as it was espoused by white mass murderer Dylan Storm Roof in his justification for the Charleston church shooting. As many scholars have noted, it has other manifestations that implicate men of color more generally as rapist invaders. The intention is, however, always the same: to produce a racialized heterogender system that materializes, meaning it comes to life through mythologies of racialized rape. The circulation of these myths sediment those meanings and animate those meanings of gender, race, and rape into our everyday life, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. My interest in the recurring historical phenomenon of the myth is to consider not just how it constructs the normative gender categories of man and woman as race categories. Rather, my focus is to ask how white individuals who either are or who have been socialized to become white women live out these histories. In this sense, my interest is not just with how histories work in the present, or what trouble and violence racist myths generate, although those are both important concerns. My work asks about how those very histories and historical myths show up in lived experience. In my book, When Time Warps the Lived Experience of Gender, Race, and Sexual Violence, I turn to the issue of lived time, how an individual experiences time, and think through, in particular, how individuals, particularly white women, live historicity. What this means is that I think we need to consider not how history is something that exists outside of us, but rather we need to consider how it gets in us, how it is in the very fabric of our embodied lives, even in ways we are unaware. Since systems and histories of power are at work on our unconscious or our pre-reflective level, since they are in the very habits of our limbs, we need ways of understanding how they are at work if we are to change. One way I conceived of the lived experience of these histories of white rape mythologies and the violence they have and continue to threaten and enact on Black and brown people is as a haunting. In Ghostly Matters, Avery Gordon gives us a way to think about how the unresolved social violence of racial capitalism haunts the historical present. My consideration of haunting goes in another direction, however. I am interested in the temporal structure of haunting, as a past that is present as an absence. I am interested in that temporal structure as an underlying structure of individual existence and embodiment. Haunting is one way, one kind of movement of how the historical past gets into my present. When we think of being haunted, we are generally speaking about the way a past event or person moves us, sometimes through fear, maybe other times through fondness. In the account I give of the history of white supremacist patriarchy, when that history haunts the life of a white individual, the racist use of the figure of the hypersexualized, predatory black man violating white womanhood slides over and does work not only in the historical present, but in the individual herself. I have been particularly interested in how the past myths of racialized rape haunt white women's subjectivity to perpetuate white supremacy in the very way white women live out gender. This consideration is important because norms of white womanhood have long served as justification for white supremacist violence, and because white women have too believed in and drawn on the very ideologies of sexualized racism to condone and produce white supremacy. So what does it mean and what does it do when a white woman is haunted by such a history of racist myths of sexual violence? Well, let's briefly consider the May 2020 Central Park birdwatching incident in which white woman Amy Cooper weaponized history against Christian Cooper. Central Park is historically a loaded place for black men, and Christian Cooper knew this quite well. But in that encounter with Amy Cooper, the historical past arrived for Christian not like a ghost, but as an explosion that threatened his life and his future. His very own time was halted, stopped, as his possible death sentence loomed closer. But what was it for Amy Cooper? Viewers of the viral video sympathetic to Christian and outraged at Amy rightfully asked, who was he to her? The answer is sadly mundane and tragic, just another black man who posed an alleged threat. For me, there is another kind of question to ask. How was Christian there for her? How was he in her present? How was the historical past animating Amy's existence, her present, her future? I ask these questions not out of sympathy for Amy Cooper, but because I am interested in the very way her experience of the present was structured by, was animated by the historical past. How did the historical past give meaning to her time? One way to understand this is to say that Christian's presence was the arrival of a ghost of the myth, crossing her present and threatening her future. Amy weaponized not only history and myth, but her experience of time to justify her own threats of violence against Christian. Of course, she was not being threatened at all, but we could say that it was the movement of history right through her. The historical past was not outside of her, but was within her. And although this was a very explicit moment in which history showed up on scene and showed up on scene for her, what about other white women and girls similarly situated enough in which history is not so obviously present, but is actually a ghost lurking, never seen, just always possibly about to show up? Who aren't as overt as Amy Cooper, but nonetheless fear the dark stranger jumping out of the bushes, who live without knowing it their future as threatened by this history. How do racialized and racist ghosts haunt the lives of these white gendered subjects? How are fears of rape distorted in ways that obscure the empirical realities of rape in order to carry the past into a white girl or woman's present? How might she carry those fears with her and not know or not mobilize them in the overt way Amy Cooper did? I ask these questions because haunting is powerful stuff. It makes people scared, fearful, threatened. For white individuals, the problem is that we've mobilized these affects to justify racist violence, even though we're not really the ones being hunted. How do old white myths haunt us and structure our existence, and in so doing allow us to unconsciously embody the historical legacy of white supremacist patriarchy? How do these histories show up in my experience of time, in my relation to my present and future? We don't only have to ask these questions as they show up in encounters between cisgender black men and cisgender white women. This is just one place to begin. My general point is that white individuals need to consider how the violent legacies of white supremacy are not only a history outside of us, external events beyond the fold of our individual embodied lives in the now. That history is in me, in my time. And we need to consider this beyond the obvious overt arrival and continuation of the past. We need to ask how the past is with us, even when we don't take it to be so.